Well, hello, and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. This is Owen Bennett-Jones sitting in for Nicholas Wood, who is in Uganda today. And we're actually talking about somewhere much closer to Europe. In Europe, it's often said that Germany is the leading economic powerhouse in terms of security, probably France, the UK, and Poland. But when it comes to the new politics, the politics of the right, there is no doubt which country is going fastest. It is Hungary. Viktor Orban, the man who championed liberal democracy after the collapse of Soviet authoritarianism, has become an authoritarian himself. And one journalist has chronicled all this right back from 1988, when he first met Orban. And he's been in Hungary not all the time, but pretty much most of the time ever since. So, Nick Thorpe, you're in an amazing position to talk about this. And you met him back in '88. Tell us about those days.
Yes, I'd been here in Hungary, Owen, since '86. I had a phone call, I think early '88, March '88, from a dissident, then Miklos Horoszty, who was one of the editors of an underground Samizdat paper at that time, saying he got a young man who'd like to speak to me. He put Viktor Orban on. He said he was going to found a youth organization, a rival to the Young Communist League, which had the appropriate name of KISS. His new organization, Federation of Young Democrats, would be called Fidesz. And I invited him round to tea, put the kettle on, and met him and a couple of his mates at that time. They launched Fidesz, and of course that later evolved. Very fast-moving political changes, the collapse of single-party rule in Hungary, or the implosion in a way, rather than explosion of it. And Orban's Fidesz became a political party, didn't do very well in the 1990 elections, but won the first time in 1998, the very first time they came to power.
And when he came to see you for that tea, was that an act of bravery, seeing a Western journalist in the system at that time?
Not really, Owen. Hungary, in that 88, 86 to 89 period, already then, there was a lot of people within the single party system as well as outside it and on the streets really doing what they liked. It was a crumbling. You almost had a sense the central authority crumbling away. The Communist Party lost confidence, really. It had ceased to be a repressive organization, but people were experimenting with how much freedom they actually had. So unlike, for example, in the then Czechoslovakia, or even more so in Romania, he wasn't really risking going to jail at that time, but they were pushing the boundaries.
How old was he then?
I think then, he's 62 now. A few days ago, he was 62. So we'll just have to calculate that. He would have been, I suppose, 25.
Right. And what was his politics then? Was he a straightforward liberal Western Democrat?
No one really knew in those days. Everyone was sort of libertarian at that time, I suppose one could say. Everyone wanted a multi-party system. You'd have demonstrators marching down the streets of Budapest chanting multi-party system. No one really understood what that meant. Some might argue they still don't know what it means. Everyone really wanted more freedom to do what they like, think what they liked, political freedom, economic freedom, and very much kind of taking advantage of a situation in the Soviet Union where Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, was in power since '85, and with Glasnost and Perestroika had made things possible. He said the Soviets wouldn't march in anymore. It was up to individual governments to do what they could to manage.
I was knocking around the Balkans. We used to meet at that time. And I remember a lot of the banners on those protests calling for change in Romania, Bulgaria, were saying Europe. It was all about Europe. We want to join Europe. Was he part of that?
He was very much part of that. He later studied with a scholarship from George Soros at Oxford University. I think he actually went for a year. He came back after 3 months. This would have been I think 89, early 90, because he needed to compete in the April 1990 elections. But he was very much a pro-European. I would say a liberal, very much a liberal with, at that point, having a strong idea of what liberalism might mean, experimenting, but always a clever person, always an ambitious person, always a very political person wanting to succeed as a politician.
Okay, so when I get a spool forward many, many years to 3 years ago, because just before we came online, I was asking you when you last met Orban, and you said that the last proper conversation you had with him was 3 years ago. So where were you? What was that conversation like? What are his politics now?
That was on the Hungarian-Ukrainian border at a town called, village called Beregshorany. It was a few days after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and large numbers of Ukrainian refugees, by then just women and children, were pouring over the Hungarian, like other borders, to escape from that Russian invasion then. And Orban was there managing issues, managing the refugee flow. He's a man, one of his critical biographers have called him a man of chaos. Not because he necessarily creates chaos, but because he thrives in a situation of chaos. It was pretty chaotic, despite all the efforts of the churches, of individual Hungarians, to the aid organizations to cope with that. He wanted to be down there early morning, rolling back his sleeves. I asked him live on the BBC, actually, at that time, what's your message this morning to Vladimir Putin and to Volodymyr Zelensky? And he said, oh, I was slightly disappointed by his answer. He said, I'm much too small a fry, smaller fish in the pan to send messages to big guys like that. All I can say is that Ukrainians are very welcome here. We're doing our best to help them, and the great powers sort of know what they're doing. So he was reluctant, even at that point, to, I suppose I was fishing for a condemnation of the full invasion, which he was always a bit mealy-mouthed about. Since 2009, when he attended a Congress of Vladimir Putin's United Russia Party in St. Petersburg, he's really liked to stay on the right side of the Russians, which is quite interesting, considering this is the politician in June '89 who said Russian troops should leave Hungary, when other opposition politicians here were wary of saying that for fear of provoking a coup attempt against Gorbachev and of Russian tanks once again on the streets.
So I guess that conversation 3 years ago was probably dominated by the Ukraine situation, but nonetheless, the question which I would be fascinated to hear if you put to him, would be, what happened to you? I mean, what happened to this Western liberal Democrat turned into this pro-Russia autocrat? Have you ever managed to have that conversation?
I've never put it as frankly, as firmly as that, Owen, but he hasn't actually given me an interview since 2009, because while he was in opposition from 2002 to 2010, when he won a landslide victory, I think his relations, or his party's relations to me, they rather liked me because I was doing my job, I think, holding anyone in power to account. And when he was in power, he hasn't been so keen on me holding him and his party to account. But I would quote actually something very fresh that partly answers your question. This was a podcast this morning, actually, between Sobolt Dol, who's the former editor of Telex, which is a very critical, very popular and critical online media, and Tibor Navracsics, who's sort of one of the last, as it were, centre-right figures in the Orban cabinet. He's actually Minister for Regional Development. And Navracsics was talking about why Orban has been so successful, really. And he said the key to his success is that he's partly his personal empathy, and I can confirm this. When you sit down with him, he's so charming. He could talk the hind leg off a donkey. He's a very charming person. You see this when he meets politicians in the European Union or in the former Biden administration who clearly dislike him. But you can see there, he forces them to smile, he wins them over. But what Mr. Navracsics said in the podcast just this morning was that Orban has a skill, an astonishing skill, as he put it, to integrate people from quite a wide range of conservative liberal. He said, the way he phrased it was from conservative liberal to national radical. perspectives, to channel. He actually listens to them because he is a good listener when you sit down with him, but you can see his brain functioning almost. He's trying to integrate that into the message, the very simple 3-word or whatever sentence. So he channels all of these opinions into rather smart and quickly. As a footballer, because he was a footballer, I remember his coach saying that he's very quick on the ball. He can turn an opportunity into a scoring opportunity, and he can get the ball on the edge of the penalty area, and he can swivel around. He's put on a bit of weight now. I don't think he plays so much football, but certainly politically, he's still doing that. So he channels all this thing, and so he's the only person. That's how he's held his party together and stayed so prominent all this time, stayed in power, 16 years, 15 years now, plus 4 before, 19 years of the last 32, by integrating all that and swallowing up all the other voices from the right to the centre right.
But I guess what I would like to know about him is he principled or unprincipled? I mean, put it like this, his politics have changed so much. Is that because he just thinks that's the way to stay in power? It's purely pragmatic, that he's very, very perceptive. He could see that liberal democracy was coming. He got on that bandwagon. He could see that far-right politics was coming. So he just changed bandwagons and got onto that. Or has actually his core beliefs changed?
It's difficult to say that. I'm not sure. And he'd be upset if he was watching this program now, which I guess he's probably not, that if I said he's not really a man of principle, but he is a man of power who understands power. To say opportunist, I think, would be unfair. I think he's a very skilled political operator who set out to become a politician at the beginning of his career. And if you're going to do a job, I suppose you do it really well. One of my favorite quotes about him came from a guy called Peter Rona, who's a fellow of at Oxford University, who didn't interview, he chatted. He had a coffee with the young Viktor Orban in 1991. So when he was still nominally a liberal before his conservative turn in 93, when he turned Fidesz from a more liberal into a more conservative party. And Peter Rona asked him over coffee, so what's your plan? And Orban said, I want to make a modern conservative party. And Peter Rona, as a conservative himself, well, that's a very laudable aim. But in Hungarian, knowing Hungarian history, you should remember that in the past century, there were many other attempts to create a modern conservative party in Hungary. But when the going got rough, politicians were very quick to drop the modern word. And Orban, to Peter Rona's surprise and disappointment, said, well, if that's necessary, so be it. And in Orban's own words, and this was again quoted by Tibor Navracsics this morning, by his own minister in his own government, he said that he's described himself, and I wasn't familiar with this quote, as to be a good politician or to lead Fidesz, you need to be a good card player. And he named a Hungarian or Central European game called Ulti, in which, well, I won't go into it's rather complicated rules. And apparently, though, the rules, I was looking it up on Wikipedia. I'd never heard of it, actually, this quote, until Navracsics mentioned it. And it says that actually one of the hardest things to play in it is that you have to agree in advance what the rules of the game are, because different players play it in different ways. And for a politician, it struck a chord there, I thought.
Just before we get on to comparisons with Trump, and also throw this open to a wider discussion with everyone who's online, is he a cruel and vindictive leader or not?
There's two answers to that. One is yes, and the other is no. People who fall out with him are normally given a second chance. Or if he sacks someone, he likes to move them sideways so that they don't become vindictive and turn against him and, organize against him. So he's quite good if someone's kicked out of a position in taking them aside afterwards, saying, don't worry about it, I'm going to find you something else. I'll make you an ambassador somewhere, or I'll set up a well-funded foundation which you can then run, and so your wife will still get those dresses or whatever. On the other hand, the cover of one of the main weekly papers here, HVG, they portrayed him in 1998 when he won the election then as him, I think, as the groom, and his then coalition partner, Jozef Tordzian of the Smallholders Party, in a wedding dress, a rather portly man in a big wedding dress. So of the two of them, a sort of gay marriage, effectively, in 1998. And he never forgave that paper. He wouldn't even speak to them or consider, I was still getting interviews for 10 years after that. HVG never got another interview after that cover. So he kept...
Right, but he didn't jail them.
He didn't jail them, and he doesn't jail journalists. I think many people watching Hungary from the West, especially from a liberal perspective or a social democratic perspective, somehow imagine that there's no media freedom here. You can actually print or publish anything you like here, but you won't get any more advertising. You might get the wrong side of the Sovereignty Protection Office. Interestingly, we had a law, a very controversial law, that was the draft has already been debated by Parliament. It was going to be voted by the large Fidesz majority, rubber stamped on the 10th of June. But that was suddenly dropped yesterday as we speak, so on June the 4th, because of objections to it. They said from within the party, from the Banking Association, from the Lawyers Association, but effectively a law described as transparency in public life was seen as a way to silence independent or critical media by accusing them of working against national sovereignty, because Mr. Orban, in this sort of rightward drift or rightward direction, this national radicalism, which he now espouses pretty publicly, a Europe of nations, to borrow a phrase from the Le Pen family, it's, sovereignty, they claim a monopoly of it, and those who don't follow their interpretation of the national interest become treacherous or seen as treacherous in some way.
Now, a couple of obvious areas we need to cover still, the comparisons with Trump and to what extent anyone on the American right is looking at Orban and following his example to some extent, or whether the influence is the other way, and all that. And then we've got elections coming up next year as well. But just to say, this is a good time now to start asking questions, and you can raise your digital hand, you can put something in chat or Q&A, and we'll pick that up. And I've just got one here. I would say developments in media, particularly social media, have played a big role in the development of European politics over recent decades. To what extent, if any, has Orban's career been influenced by the media? I mean, you're saying there's more media freedom than people think, and I want to get into what he's done to universities and other areas of public intellectual life and so on. But so what is his relationship with the media, and has it changed him?
He realized when he lost the 2002 election, which he didn't expect to lose, because he'd been in power then for 4 years. It was still the young, slim-aligned, more liberal-minded, liberal conservative or conservative. Yeah, I think liberal conservative would have been fair description then, with a strong national streak. When he lost the 2002 election, there was a sort of change in him, which has been written about to some extent. But he realized that he had to have the media on his side. He felt there was a liberal hegemony in the media, which is probably true at that time, and he needed his own media. So in 2010, when he came back to power with a landslide, he set about really a new media law. He set about, but in the background, his people, oligarchs close to him, business people close to him, started snapping up, finding ways to either close down. They closed down they found a way to close down the main opposition paper, then Népszabadság, which had survived from communist times, but it was the biggest paper in Hungary, and it disappeared pretty much overnight. Several of the main websites, web news portals, Origo and Index, which were very critical of him, those were effectively taken over and became much more pro him. But I think, again, another issue with the media that I notice more and more is it's not so much his influence on the media is not so much through public service television, which I think only 11% of the Hungarian population now watch, or even through the main commercial channels. It's rather, there's a channel called M4, which has all the sport on it, all the sport programs. So you say you're watching the Olympics or the World Cup or the European Championship. Every now and then you get a 1-minute news flash. And this is something, which all the sports-mad Hungarians who love the Olympics, especially fencing and water polo, or the football-mad Hungarians are watching. And you get these very terse, very tidy, very neatly written news bulletins, which are all about how wonderful the governing party are and how wicked and terrible the opposition are. And you get that also in the tabloid papers, and many of them, the advertisements that are pouring out of YouTube. You try and watch a music video on YouTube and you are hit immediately every day in Hungary by the latest, very beautifully edited. So his relationship, also his party is spending vast amounts on advertisements on Facebook especially. So you have a constant stream on Facebook of advertisements coming from Fidesz. So there's a permanent political campaign here. We're only 10 months or so ahead of an election, but one already has a feeling in the countryside, also from the opposition side, that the campaign has started.
Okay, and I should say that there will be a tour of Hungary about a month before that election. We'll talk about that at the end, which you will be involved with. So just another question that's come in, and I'm doing these ones that have come in on Q&A. I'm not sure if people want their names on these questions, but or want to give them visually, as it were. I'm not seeing the visuals coming. Yes, I can see the visuals. Here we are. Charles, what is your question? And you're on mute at the moment.
My question is about anti-Semitism. What's the actual level of anti-Semitism in Orban's policymaking?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'd say it's been very important. He's recognized this, as a right-wing conservative national politician in a country with such a horrific history of the Holocaust, of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews deported and murdered in Auschwitz and other camps in 1944. So Orban's always been aware of the danger of the anti-Semitic label and has done his utmost very successfully, especially by building close relations with Benjamin Netanyahu and his Israeli government to do everything to avoid that label, also with laws and outlawing the use of fascist or communist symbols for that matter. So he's very aware of it, and especially through his friendship with Netanyahu, his criticism of the EU and of the former Biden administration on Israel, even when, for example, the EU wanted to call on the Netanyahu government last year not to send troops into Rafah in Gaza, Orban vetoed that in the EU. So it's not just about rhetoric and friendship, it's actually about close relations with the Netanyahu and also defending Israel in international forums, including at the UN. It's financially advantageous for the Orban government, Israeli investment, and even the buying of Pegasus software to listen in on critical journalists and other people in the country. So close relationship with Israel. I mean, in terms of the Hungarian, again, I think this is not a particularly anti-Semitic country. Perhaps the far right, further right than Fidesz, the former Jobbik party, were criticized for anti-Semitism until it turned out that one of their leading figures had Jewish ancestry himself. So it is an issue sometimes here, but it's one that Orban has used, rather like the war in Ukraine, quite cleverly to strengthen his position rather than to weaken it.
You mentioned a European Union veto there, and I guess one question to put to you is there are voices saying, look, he is disruptive in Europe, he is opposing a lot of European policies, he is threatening European Union unity. and he is illiberal in a way that most Europeans don't approve of, the answer is to throw him out of the European Union, Hungary out of the European Union, and let them face the economic consequences of that. Is that a realistic prospect? Is that something that scares him? Is that something that he's worried about, or what?
He has a much more, he likes to kind of overtake on the inside, I suppose, in athletics terms. And so his policy on that has been to say, to reach out with interviews to Bild Zeitung in Germany, for example, to reach over the heads of more liberal or centre-right politicians, to reach out to the interviews in Le Point in France, for example, to reach out to the ordinary French people who would vote for the Rassemblement National, to the AfD, or to the more right-wing fringes of the CSU and the CDU in Germany. He fostered his relationship, his friendship with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So basically, it's rather, while the left or the liberals in Europe might be, or the Greens for that matter, might be calling out for years now for him to be squeezed out of the EU project if he doesn't play by the rules. His project is much bigger, is to not to leave, not to take Hungary out of the EU with some kind of Huxit, but rather to take over Brussels, to take over the EU from the inside, to turn it into a Europe of nations. And of course, he now has allies in that endeavor. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Herbert Kickl in Austria, other politicians, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. He's been cultivating his friendship with Alice Weidel of the AfD, the co-leader of the AfD. So basically, he wants nothing less. Rather than being on the defensive, whenever he's attacked by liberals, he turns any attack from the liberal side into rather like a sort of martial arts practitioner. He turns it to his advantage to say, look, we're going to occupy. And he loves this dissident language, critical language. He portrays himself as a dissident among European conservatives, but one who's winning the argument. And now with the headwind of Donald Trump in power in the United States, you feel he can sort of, that the right or the radical right can take over the European project. He feels he's on.
That's very, very interesting. I hadn't realized he was thinking like that. Yeah. Okay, we've got a question from Nick Wood in Uganda.
Hello, greetings from Kampala, Nick. Good to see you there. I think I've outlined very clearly how he's managed to sort of keep a step ahead of the Commission and sort of would-be liberals in Europe, and point himself. And he's got international standing. If you think of Viktor Orban, he's a well-known global leader. But you're going to be there with us a month ahead of the elections next year, leading a tour which we're really looking forward to. There was excitement when we were there for the last time that there was a possibility that he might lose, but the opposition was clearly didn't have the heft, was probably too divided. And I just want to understand how is Orban beginning, has his popularity subsided at home? And does that mean that there's a possibility of him losing? Or is the system so rigged in his favour that it's very difficult for any opposition to win?
It has been, thanks, Nick, and good to see you there in Kampala. His star does seem to be sliding down the horizon. His popularity is waning, largely because in the past the opposition has been very divided in Hungary. And Orban rewrote the electoral system. He rewrote the constitution in 2011, soon after that first landslide victory, to make the playing field electorally, but also in many other ways, slope towards him to make his own goal, as it were, smaller and the opposition goal bigger. And he did that by the legislation effectively favoured a two-party system rather than a multi-party system, and it also made that the winner kind of takes all. So if you win, if you get 47%, if you come first with 47% in a Hungarian election, that normally translates into 65%, 66% quite easily. So he did that in the knowledge that the opposition was very divided, and he's been very effective in front of the scenes and behind the scenes in keeping the opposition divided. But all of that changed in February last year, so February 2024, with the emergence, the unexpected emergence of a man called Péter Magyar, the appropriately named man who's emerged as the leader of the opposition. Magyar, of course, being Peter the Hungarian. That's how it's translated by Google Translate, if you run it through. So Peter the Hungarian appeared on the scene from the ranks. He's a businessman who was married to Orban's former justice minister, Judit Varga, and he started to be... he said he'd been biting his lip in all the years he'd been married to a member of the Orban cabinet, but since then he's come out more and more. He founded a party, Tisza, named after Hungary's second biggest river after the Danube, and he's been hitting the Fidesz policies very hard, especially not on foreign policy. He leaves all of that to Orban, not on Ukraine, not on rule of law issues or freedom of the media or so on. He's been hitting Fidesz very hard on the terrible state of education and healthcare and the extent of corruption in a party which has been in power now for 15 years. And also Péter Magyar is a very savvy user of social media, especially of Facebook. He's constantly touring the country, running Facebook Lives, which were being watched by 10, 20, 30,000 people who were getting the message out there. And all of that has created a situation where here we are 10 months before the election, and in an opinion poll published this morning, Tisza party is leading by 9 percentage points among decided voters and 7 percentage points or 6 percentage points among the population as a whole. There's a couple of cautionary notes one should add to that. It certainly doesn't mean that Orban's lost this election and already. There's still 10 months to go. Fidesz have been throwing, they have enormous resources to throw mud at Péter Magyar and the Tisza party. And the Tisza party has certain weaknesses itself. It's pretty much a one-man party for now. So Péter Magyar has been reluctant to, put together a shadow cabinet or whatever. He's a bit thin on the ground with experts on different issues who could become ministers. So at the moment, he's very much riding on dissatisfaction. It's a vote against Fidesz. Finally, perhaps half the countries that's fed up with Orban and with his messages, or got bored of or seen through his messages in the past 15 years. So it's very much a sort of anti-Fidesz vote for now. And Péter Magyar, to win next year, will need to convince, I've read figures, 700,000 or 800,000 people who voted for Fidesz in 2022 to actually switch. So it's not enough just to mop up all the old opposition votes. He has to convince centrists who are left in the Fidesz camp that Orban until now has been so clever at integrating, keeping on side, reaching out to. Magyar needs to get those voices to win. But if he does win, because of the electoral system, he could win big. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that Péter Magyar could win a 2/3 majority, which would allow him to change the constitution and prevent what's left of the Fidesz government or supporters sabotaging any policies that he tries to follow. But we're a long way from that still.
That would be astonishing, Nick. And I hesitate to think that Orban and Fidesz would actually allow that to happen. I mean, they're very clever, and I'm sure there'd be some technical way of foiling that, let alone they can dominate the media sphere anyway. I mean, I think you win elections by keeping things simple. You don't necessarily have to have policies on everything. You don't necessarily have to have ministers allocated here and there. A very simple message and a conservative message. We met Péter Magyar with you, and he's an impressive politician. But I wonder whether, even if he does win the election, whether that works.
Yeah. No one knows, really. Everyone's got so used to Viktor Orban being in power. I remember my colleague at the Observer newspaper in the early 1990s, I think, John Sweeney, once saying, when Margaret Thatcher fell from power, John wrote in the in The Observer at that time, there are many young people in Britain today who've never made love under another prime minister than Margaret Thatcher. And I think if Orban were to fall next year, and I say, very cautiously, I think many Hungarians would be in that position.
Can we just get into a bit of the Trump comparisons? So you've talked about the media and saying that he dominates the media, but there is still some space for other voices online and so on. When we look at what's happening in America, universities, law firms, Congress, judges, how much of that is happening? And also, are you seeing Americans from the Republican Party coming to Hungary, talking to Fidesz, having a look at it? Are there channels of communication there?
Absolutely. There's a very strong transatlantic, cross-Atlantic flow in both directions, really. I think when Trump was first in power, he didn't really take Orban too seriously. Orban backed him then. He was the only EU leader to do so, which Orban, I think he was rather disappointed. There were few brownie points from that, few advantages that came to him. But this time round, Trump was away for 4 years, of course, from power. And in that time, a great deal of work went into, between the sort of MAGA side of the Republican Party, the Heritage Foundation and so on, a lot of cross-fertilization there. They were very impressed. I think the Republicans were very impressed. And we're talking here about J.D. Vance in particular, but many other public figures are very impressed by Orban. His ability to win, his ability to simplify the message, and also his ability the winner takes all, effectively, which we're seeing now with Trump, of course, as well. So I think I wouldn't be exaggerating Orban's importance to say that the MAGA wing of which now dominates the Republican Party, learnt a lot of tricks from Orban. Viktor Orban closed down an organization, university, the Central European University, starting in 2017, which was a kind of thorn in his side. He loves, as a populist politician, though I suppose all politicians are populist, but he doesn't win elections just on what he does, what he stands for, but on his ability to create a powerful enemy image, his ability to polarize society. He's not alone in that. The liberals and social democrats here, or socialists here, were also had a polarizing effect on society, but Orban's been much better at that, more skilled at polarizing society, at demonizing his enemies, if you like. But so far, so he's been very good at demonizing the liberals, but radicalizing himself. Centrist politicians, Tibor Navracsics this morning in the podcast, said that when he was asked where does he stand in the Orban constellation, he said, well, I used to be in the center of it, and now I'm on the periphery. And Orban's former ambassador to the United States, Rika Semerkenyi, was also an Atlanticist. There's only, I think you could count on one hand the Atlanticists left in the Orban administration. So he's steered his party, his country very much to the right. He's got a name for himself. He's the first Hungarian prime minister who people around the world, even in South America, in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, would know the name of. He's made Hungary famous. But now, just at the moment when internationally his star is most visible and brightest, he might have the rug pulled out from underneath him by a challenger that no one in the world has ever heard of.
Nick again.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. Obviously, domestic politics matters more than anything else when it comes to an election. But the thing that slightly shocks me is Orban's ease of his alliance with Putin, his closeness to Putin. This is a country that surely must have sore memories of '56. It was that wonderful book, Under the Frog, where there's a great novel about the Russian troops coming into Budapest, and they've also got all their watches up their arms because they're stealing everything left, right, and centre. That's the Second World War. Then '56 happens again. All these people flee Hungary. I suppose those bitter memories have died out. I find it very difficult. I've got Hungarian friends in the UK who watch Hungarian TV, but are completely swayed by Fidesz media, and they have a skepticism towards Ukraine and a sympathy towards Putin, who's a strongman. And I struggle to understand how this country that suffered so much at the hands of Russia cannot have so much the right kind of sympathy for Ukraine.
Just to add to that, before you answer it, Nick, it's interesting because I had a conversation with a Romanian in the UK and asking him, is there a memory in Romania of Russian dominance and how unhappy a situation that was? He said, not really at all. No, I mean, people aren't voting on that. They're voting on more recent issues. Is that right?
Yes. There's quite a lot there to unpack. Starting with Nick's question about Orban, I think it's a sign of what a skillful political maneuverer, skillful actor he is, that in an election year, February 2022, when I last bumped into him, that exactly all those Hungarian memories. Also remember that Hungary's, the voting base for Fidesz, he's taken them with him from the 80s, who were in their 20s then, who became part of that Fidesz subculture in a way in Hungary at the fall of communism. He's carried them through with him. So a big part of his voting base is now in their 60s and 70s, actually. So they would have, if not memories of 1956, but they would have, close relatives who remembered it. And so the way he's done that is with the word peace. Because Hungary's been overrun so many times. It was occupied by the Ottomans, by the Habsburgs, by the Soviets. So one thing that Hungarians feel, they've lost most of the wars they've fought. And so the average Hungarian would say they're in favor of peace almost at any cost. They just want a quiet life. They don't want they know because of their experience of war and of deportation and so on. So Orban very skillfully presented himself to the elections in 2022 and still now in 2025 and no doubt next year as the man who can guarantee peace, and that his enemies, his political rivals, would drag Hungary into war. I've just brought a leaflet from Peter Magyar's Tisza party that came through my door a couple of days ago. I don't know if you can be able to see this. Peter Magyar at the top, looking rather like a young version of Orban, albeit without the beard. And at the bottom, Viktor Orban. And at the top, this is an opposition poster. The Tisza party wants peace. Fidesz wants war. So here, he's challenging. This is the bravery or the boldness or the recklessness of the opposition challenger. And here you have, basically turning around Orban's own black and white propaganda into a black and white message of its own. And there's a picture of Orban with Putin at the top. And so challenging, and this is how he's emerged, I suppose, as an opposition challenger, because he's managed to seize the agenda which Fidesz has dominated for so long. So that's in terms of how Orban has. But another, I suppose, more practical way to answer your and Nick's question there is that in terms of an opening to the East, one of the ways Orban has managed to thumb his nose at Brussels and the EU majority, while it's still a majority, is to say, I'm going to open to the East. I'm going to do big business with Russia and with China. There are 27 Chinese companies at this moment in Hungary building electric vehicles, building batteries for electric vehicles, building BYD vehicles. He's welcomed them in. And of course, the Chinese are happy because they can dodge EU tariffs and so on their goods by manufacturing in Hungary electric car batteries for Mercedes, BMW, Audi, and the Volkswagen and all the rest of them. So he's welcomed. He says Hungary, as a small country in Central Europe, and one can only, I suppose, agree with him on this. His political director, Balázs Orbán's even written a book about connectivity. We need to be part of the global exchange. We need to have continue the flow of Russian oil, Russian gas, which they say we're getting at a wonderful premium at a low price. That's not strictly true. The Russians are building a nuclear power station, albeit many years behind the extension of an existing nuclear power station. So really, Orban's message to his electorate, when you get an electricity bill in Hungary, it's highlighted. Electricity companies are forced to put onto it, highlighted in yellow bold, how much money they're saving as a result of the government's intervention to keep prices down. You walk past a bank in the high street, it's got posters in the window offering special loans to couples who agree to have one or two or ideally three or more children. So even the banks, even the energy companies are finding themselves advertently or inadvertently advertising this Orban's rules. So it's not just about an authoritarian guy taking it all over and stamping on people's fingers. He's captured the state, in the words of the opposition, and that's what's made him so difficult to combat over these years.
Just on the opposition, it is very interesting what you've said. I hadn't appreciated this before listening to you, that the challenge to him is coming from the right. So where is the Hungarian left?
The Hungarian left is pretty much disoriented and battered and beaten into submission. They've effectively collapsed. The old Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, who recreated themselves as a Hungarian Socialist Party, as a centre-left party after 1990, they've been whittled away, really. They've been outmaneuvered, outpaced, and won't enter parliament, or certainly in the next election. The Liberals, I think liberalism has never really been very strong in Hungary, which is why Orban ditched it as soon as he could and became a conservative, because this is a pretty socially conservative country. So, you know, to be the main conservative party was always going to be a potential winner if you could swallow up, turn up, bring together under one flag, as Orban has done, all the conservatives, anyone with a mildly conservative or conservative views, and swallow them all up. If you can hammer the liberals and turn them into traitors, which again is what he's done. The migration issue in 2015, none of those migrants, asylum seekers actually wanted to come to Hungary. Hungary built a fence. He said he was defending Europe from migrants. And again, it's a parallel here with Trump and the Trump's wall against people crossing from South and Central America. Orban building that fence, saying that we're going to keep all these people out of Hungary and indeed out of the European Union, and therefore the EU should pay for our wonderful double electrified fence on the southern border, even though none of those people actually wanted. It's not an immigration issue. It was always, those were always people that wanted to wander across Hungary on their way to richer countries in Western Europe.
Got a question from Diane.
Can I make a comment first? Excuse me. With Nicholas and Karen, I was at Ciampino Airport after the late Pope's funeral, on the day of the funeral, and we were watching the planes coming in to pick up the great and the good. And Orban's was a rather large military jet in the usual kind of dark, sinister colour. Everybody else's was actually quite elegant. I just leave that as a comment. But my question is, could you say something, please, about Hungary's economy? I mean, I'm not really au fait with what its strengths and weaknesses are, but what is good for people and what is perhaps not so good for people at the moment?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Diane. Yeah, it's very important to understand about the Hungarian economy that it's, in a sense, very much dependent on trade with Germany. I think something like a third of the Hungarian economy is, I can't remember if this is actually the GDP or basically all the German car factories, all the companies producing parts for German cars has created a situation where if the German economy is doing well, then the Hungarian economy is doing well. And if the German economy, as now, is stagnating or edging towards recession in any sense, then the Hungarian economy doesn't do well either. And I think it's a crucial question, because I think at the end of the day, Orban's won all these elections because the ordinary Hungarians feel that since the last election, their standard of living has improved a bit. And you can't say that anymore, because of the state of the European economy, of the German economy, and therefore of the Hungarian economy. So now, if he loses next year, and it's a big if, it'll be less about corruption, the education system and the health system, but people will feel he's broken their promises, that they're no longer, becoming better off, however mildly, and therefore they're a pragmatic people and they'll vote him out of office, for all the rhetoric from either side. That's what's happening. So in a nutshell, that's the most important thing to understand about the economy, I think.
We're running out of time a bit, and we're going to wrap, and I do want to sort of preview your tour next year, which we will do in just a moment. Just one quick thing on how important is Christian rhetoric to Orban? Is that a big part of it? Is that resonating with the Hungarian electorate?
I think it resonates with the Europeans and the Americans rather than with the Hungarians. This is not a country of very big on church going. And back in 1993, as a measure of how much Orban himself has changed on this, he made some fairly derogatory comments about the Pope, the then Pope John Paul II, which would no longer, certainly not be made now. So it's important that he wears his Christianity on his sleeve, but even he would say it's a cultural Christianity rather than a kind of deep faith, though it appeals to older people, more socially conservative, more Christian part of the population. But it's especially popular among the right wing in Poland, on the right wing in the United States.
Right, and let's look ahead. You, next March, and we'll get some slides up that illustrate all this, are going to be doing a tour of Hungary. I mean, you've just made the point, I think, in this webinar that it's not just about Hungary. It's about Europe, and it's even broader than that. The only Hungarian leader who's got an international profile, really, for ever. So tell us about what you'd be able to put on during this tour in March next year, just before the elections, right?
Sure. So this would be a tour both of Budapest, where we would meet, political leaders from the government, from the opposition, and also of the countryside. Our plan, as it stands, is to go to the east of Hungary, to visit Debrecen, for example, a big city with all this Chinese investment there. It's also a big university city. To visit the Tokai wine region, which is a stronghold, as much of the countryside traditionally was, of the Fidesz party. So we would have an interesting, I think, a fascinating tour of the politics on the eve of the election, where Orban is facing his biggest ever challenge politically, and the opposition, or people who are critical of Orban, have probably their first big chance in 16 years to edge him out of power. Politics,
food and wine.
Exactly.
Sounds very good. Thank you very much, Nick Thorpe. You have been there since the late 1980s, 86, I think you said. It's an amazing journalistic career you've had, because you're, so on top of this fascinating country that's become, I guess, more important than you ever imagined it could have been when you started out.